Hi guys, it's Jennifer and welcome back to my channel. I apologize that the story time video is just now being uploaded as it instead of Wednesday. I've been having some problems with my internet. So, and also because of due to the problems with the internet that I've been having, everything, all the videos that are scheduled, you know, that I usually do every day, Monday through Friday, will be back on schedule next week, or yeah, next week starting Monday. And I do apologize. It's been crazy around here, and I do apologize. We left off in in the middle of a chapter, and I was going to do a recap, but I'm just going to start where we left off. Some of you may remember that she spent the night at Dinah Barry's house, and they got an unexpected guest when they went into the bed, in the bedroom, in the spare bedroom. But then there is our side of it too. Have you any imagination, Mrs. Barry? If you have, just put yourself in our place. We didn't know there was anybody in that bed, and you nearly scared us to death. It was simply awful the way we felt. And then we couldn't sleep in the spare bedroom after being promised. I suppose you are used to sleeping in spare rooms, but just imagine what you would feel like if you were a little orphan girl who had never had such an honor. All the snap had gone by this time. Miss Barry actually laughed, a sound which caused Dinah, waiting in speechless anxiety in the kitchen outside, to give a great gasp of relief. I'm afraid my imagination is a little rusty. It's so long since I've used it, she said. I dare say you claim the sympathy is just as strong as mine. It all depends on the way we look at it. Sit down here and tell me about yourself. I'm very sorry I can't, said Anne firmly. I would like to because you seem like an interesting lady. And you might even be a kindred spirit, although you don't look very much like it. But it is my duty to go home to Miss Marilla Cuthbert. Miss Marilla Cuthbert is a very kind lady who has taken me to bring up properly. She is doing her best, but it is very discouraging work. You must not blame her because I jumped on the bed. But before I go, I do wish you would tell me if you will forgive Dinah and stay just as long as you meant to in Avonlea. I think perhaps I will, if you'll come over and talk to me occasionally, said Miss Barry. That evening, Miss Barry gave Dinah a silver bangle bracelet and told the senior members of the household that she had unpacked her valise. I've made up my mind to stay, simply for the sake of getting acquainted with that Anne girl, she said frankly. She amuses me, and at my time of life, an amusing person is a rarity. Marilla's only comment when she heard the story was, I told you so. This was for Matthew's benefit. Miss Barry stayed her month out and over. She was a more agreeable guest than usual for Anne to keep in her humor. They became firm friends. When Miss Barry went away, she said, Remember, you Anne girl, when you come to town, you're to visit me, and I'll put you in my very sparest spare room bed to sleep. Miss Barry was a kindred spirit after all, Anne confided to Marilla. You wouldn't think so to look at her, but she is. You don't find it right out at first, as in Matthew's case, but after a while you come to see it. Kindred spirits are not so scarce as I used to think. It's splendid to find out there's so many in the world. Chapter 20, A Good Imagination Gone Wrong. Spring had come once more to Green Gables. Sorry, guys. The beautiful, capricious, reluctant Canadian spring, lingering along through April and May in a succession of sweet, fresh, chilly days with pink sunsets and miracles of resurrection and growth. The maples in Lover's Lanes were red-budded, and little curly ferns pushed up around the dryad's bubble. Away up in the barrens behind Mr. Silas Sloane's place, the mayflowers blossomed out, pink and white stars of sweetness under their brown leaves. All the schoolgirls and boys had one golden afternoon gathering them. coming home in a clear, echoing twilight with arms and baskets full of flowery spoil. I am so sorry for the people who live in lands where there are no Mayflowers, said Anne. Dinah says perhaps they have something better, but there couldn't be anything better than Mayflowers, could there, Marilla? And Dinah says if they don't know what they're like, they don't miss them. But I think that is the saddest thing of all. I think it would be tragic, Marilla, not to know what Mayflowers are like and not to miss them. Do you know what I think Mayflowers are, Marilla? I think they must be souls of flowers that died last summer, and this is their heaven. But we had a splendid time today, Marilla. We had our lunch down in a big mossy hollow by an old well, such a romantic spot. Charlie Sloane dared Artie Gillis to jump over it, and Artie did because he wouldn't take a dare. Nobody would in school. It is very fashionable to dare. Mr. Phillips gave all the Mayflowers he found to Prissy Andrews, and I heard him to say sweets to the sweet. He got that out of a book, I know, but it shows he has some imagination. I was offered some Mayflowers too, but I rejected him with scorn. I can't tell you the person's name because I vowed never to let it cross my lips. We made wreaths of the Mayflowers and put them on our hats, and when time came to go home, we marched in a procession down the road, 2 by 2, with our bouquets and wreaths, singing My Home on the Hill. Oh, it was so thrilling, Marilla. All Mr. Silas Sloane's folks rushed out to see us, and everybody we met on the road stopped and stared after us. We made a real sensation. Not much wonder, such silly doings, was Marilla's response. After the Mayflowers came the violets, and Violet Vale was empurpled with them. Anne walked through it on her way to school with reverent steps and worshipping eyes, as if she trod on holy ground. Somehow, she told Diana, when I'm going through here, I don't really care whether Gil or whether anybody gets ahead of me in class or not. But when I'm up in school, it's all different. I care as much as ever. There's such a lot of different Annes in me. I sometimes think that's why I'm such a troublesome person. If I was just the one Anne, it would ever so much more comfortable. But then it wouldn't be half so interesting. One June evening, when the orchids were pink blossomed again, when the frogs were singing silvery sweet in the marshes about the head of the lake of shining waters, and the air was full of the savor of clover fields and balsamic fir woods, Anne was sitting by her green gable. She had been studying her lessons, but it had grown too dark to see the book. She had fallen into wide-eyed reverie, looking out past the boughs of the Snow Queen, once more bestarred with its tufts of blossom. In all essential respects, the little gabled chamber was unchanged. The walls were as white, the pincushions as hard, the chairs as stiffly and yellowy upright as ever. Yet the whole character of the room was altered. It was full of new vital, pulsing personality that seemed to pervade it and it be quite independent of schoolgirl books and dresses and ribbons, and even of the cracked blue jug full of apple blossoms on the table. It was as if all the dreams, sleeping and waking, of its vivid occupant had taken a visible, although unmaterial, form and had tapestried the bare room with splendid, filmy tissues of rainbow and moonshine. Presently, Marilla came briskly in with some of Anne's fresh iron school aprons. She hung them over a chair and sat down with a short sigh. She had had one of her headaches that afternoon, and all the pain had gone. She felt weak and tuckered out, as she expressed it. Anne looked at her with eyes limpid with sympathy. I do truly wish I could have the headache in your place, Marilla. I would have endured it joyfully for your sake. I guess you did your part in attending to the work and letting me rest, said Marilla. You seem to have gotten on fairly well and made fewer mistakes than usual. Of course, it wasn't exactly necessary to starch Matthew's handkerchiefs, and most people, when they put a pie in the oven to warm up for dinner, take it out and eat it when it gets hot, instead of leaving it to be burnt to crisp. But that doesn't seem to be your way, evidently. Headaches always left Marilla somewhat sarcastic. Oh, I'm so sorry, said Anne penitently. I never thought about that. pie from the moment I put it in the oven till now, although I felt instinctively that there was something missing on the dinner table. I was firmly resolved when you left me in charge this morning not to imagine anything, but kept my thoughts on facts. I did pretty well until I put the pie in, and then an irresistible temptation came to me to imagine I was an enchanted princess shut up in a lonely tower with a handsome knight riding to my rescue on a coal black steed. So that is how I came to forget the pie. I didn't know I starched the handkerchiefs. All the time I was ironing, I was trying to think of a name for a new island Dinah and I had discovered up the brook. It's the most ravishing spot, Marilla. There are 2 maple trees on it, and the brook flows right around it. At last it struck me that it would be splendid to call it Victoria Island, because we found it on Queen's birthday. But Dinah and I are very loyal. But I'm sorry about that pie and the handkerchiefs. I wanted to be extra good today because it's an anniversary. Do you remember what happened this day last year, Marilla? No, I can't think of anything at all. Oh, Marilla, it was the day I came to Green Gables. I shall never forget it. It was the turning point in my life. Of course, it wouldn't seem so important to you. I've been here for a year, and I've never been so happy. Of course, I've had my troubles, but one can live down troubles. Are you sorry you kept me, Marilla? No, I can't say I'm sorry, said Marilla, who sometimes wondered how she could have lived before Anne came to Green Gables. No, not exactly sorry. If you finished your lessons, Anne, I want you to run over and ask Mrs. Barry if she'll lend me Dinah's apron pattern. Oh, it's too dark, cried Anne. Too dark? Why, it's only twilight, and goodness knows you've gone over often enough after dark. I'll go over early in the morning, said Anne eagerly. I'll get up at sunrise and go over, Marilla. What has gotten into your head now, Anne Shirley? I want that pattern to cut out your new apron this evening. Go at once and be smart, too. I'll have to go around by the road then, said Anne, taking up her hat reluctantly. Go by the road and waste half an hour? I'd like to catch you. I can't go through the haunted wood, Marilla, cried Anne desperately. Marilla stared. The haunted wood? Are you crazy? What under the canopy is the haunted wood? The spruce wood over the brook, said Anne in a whisper. Fiddlesticks! There's no such thing as a haunted wood anywhere. Who's been telling you such stuff? Nobody, confessed Anne. Dinah and I just imagined the wood was haunted. All the places around here are so commonplace. We just got this up for our own amusement. We began it in April. A haunted wood is so very romantic, Marilla. We chose the spruce grove because it's so gloomy. Oh, we have imagined the most harrowing things. There's a white lady walks along the brook just about this time of the night and wrings out her hands and utters wailing cries. She appears when there is to be a death in the family, and the ghost of a little murdered child haunts the corner up by Idlewood. It creeps up behind you and lays its cold fingers on your hands. Oh, Marilla, it gives me a shudder to think about it. And there's a headless man stalks up and down the path, and skeletons glower at you between the boughs. Oh, Marilla, I wouldn't go through the haunted wood after dark now for anything. I'd be sure that the white things would reach out from behind the trees and grab me. Did ever anyone hear the like? Ejaculated Marilla, who had listened in dumb amazement. Aunt Shirley, do you mean to tell me you believe all that wicked nonsense of your own imagination? Not believe exactly, faltered Anne. At least I don't believe it in the daylight. But after dark, Marilla, it's different. That is when ghosts walk. There are no such thing as ghosts, Anne. Oh, but there are, Marilla, cried Anne eagerly. I know people who have seen them, and they are respectable people. Charlie Sloane says that his grandmother saw his grandfather driving home the cows one night after he'd been buried for a year. You know, Charlie Sloane's grandmother wouldn't tell a story for anything. She's a very religious woman. And Mrs. Thomas's father had pursued home one night by a lamb of fire with its head cut off, hanging by a strip of skin. He also knew it was the spirit of his brother, and that it was a warning he would die within 9 days. He didn't, but he died 2 days after. So you see, it was really true. And Ruby Gillis says, "And Shirley," interrupted Marilla firmly, "I never want to hear you talking in this fashion again. I've had my doubts about that imagination of yours right along, and this is going to be the outcome of it. I won't countenance at any such doings. You'll go right over to Barry's, and you'll go through that spruce grove just for a lesson and a warning to you. And never let me hear a word out of your head about haunted woods again." Anne might plead and cry as she liked, and did, for her terror was very real. Her imagination had run away with her, and she held the spruce grove in mortal dread after nightfall. But Marilla was inexorable. She marched the shrinking glass seer down to the spring and ordered her to proceed straight away. Over the bridge and into the dusky retreats of wailing ladies and headless specters beyond. "Oh, Marilla, how can you be so cruel?" sobbed Anne. "What would you feel like if a white thing did snatch me up and carry me off?" "I'll risk it," said Marilla unfeelingly. "You know I always mean what I say, and I'll cure you of imagining ghosts into places. March, now." Anne marched. That is, she stumbled over the bridge and went shuddering up the horrible dim path beyond. Anne never felt that walk. Bitterly did she repent the license she had given to her imagination. The goblins of her fancy lurked in every shadow about her, reaching out their cold, fleshless hands to grasp the terrified small girl who had called them into being. A white strip of birch bark blowing up from the hollow over the brown floor of the grove made her heart stand still. The long, drawn-out wail of two old boughs rubbing against each other brought out the perspiration in beads on her forehead. The swoop of bats in the darkness over her was as the wings of unearthly creatures. And when she reached Mr. William Bell's field, she fled across it as if pursued by an army of white things, and arrived at the Barry kitchen door so out of breath that she could hardly gasp out her request for the apron pattern. Dinah was away, so that she had no excuse to linger. The dreadful return journey had to be faced. Anne went back over it with shut eyes, preferably to take the risk of dashing her brains out among the boughs, so that of seeing a white thing. When she finally stumbled over the log bridge, she drew one long, shivering breath of relief. "Well, so nothing caught you," said Marilla unsympathetically. "Oh, Marilla," chattered Anne, "I'll be content with commonplaces after this." Chapter 21. A New Departure in Flavorings. "Dear me, there is nothing but meetings and partings in this world, as Mrs. Lynde says," remarked Anne plaintively, putting her slate and books down on the kitchen table on the last day of June and wiping her red eyes with a very damp handkerchief. "Wasn't it fortunate, Marilla, that I took an extra handkerchief to school today? I had presentiment that it would be needed." "I never thought you were so fond of Mr. Phillips that you'd require 2 handkerchiefs to dry your tears just because he was going away," said Marilla. "I don't think I was crying because I was really so very fond of him," reflected Anne. "I just cried because all the others did. It was Ruby Gillis started it." Ruby Gillis was always declared she hated Mr. Phillips, but just as soon as he got up to make his farewell speech, she burst into tears. Then all the girls began to cry, one after the other. I tried to hold out, Marilla. I tried to remember the time Mr. Phillips made me sit with a boy, and the time he spelled my name without an E on the blackboard, and how he said I was the worst dunce he ever saw at geometry and laughed at my spelling, and all the times he had been so horrid and sarcastic. But somehow I couldn't, Marilla. I just had to cry too. Jane Andrews has been talking for a month about how glad she'd be when Mr. Phillips went away, and she declared she'd never shed a tear. Well, she was worse than any of us, and had to borrow a handkerchief from her brother. Of course, the boys didn't cry, because she hadn't brought one of her own, not expecting to need it. Oh, Marilla, it was heartrending. Mr. Phillips made such a beautiful farewell speech beginning. The time has come for us to part. It was very affecting. And he had tears in his eyes too, Marilla. Oh, I felt dreadfully sorry and remorseful for all the times I've talked in school and draw pictures of him on my slate and made fun of him and Prissy. I can tell you I wished I'd been a model pupil like Minnie Andrews. She hadn't anything on her conscience. The girls cried all the way home from school. And Carrie Sloane kept saying every few minutes, the time has come for us to part. And that would start us off again whenever we were in danger of cheering up. I do feel dreadfully sad, Marilla, but one can't feel quite in the depths of despair with too much vacation before them. Can they, Marilla? And besides, we met the new minister and his wife coming from the station. For all I was feeling so sad about Mr. Phillips going away, I couldn't help take a little interest in a new minister. Could I? His wife is very pretty. Not exactly regally lovely, of course. It wouldn't do. I suppose for a minister to have a regally lovely wife because it might set a bad example. Mrs. Lynde says the minister's wife over at Newbridge sets a very bad example because she dresses so fashionably. Our new minister's wife was dressed in blue muslin with lovely puff sleeves and a hat trimmed with roses. Jane Andrews said she thought puff sleeves were too worldly for a minister's wife. But I don't make any such uncharitable remark, Marilla, because I know what it's like to long for puff sleeves. Besides, she's only a minister's wife for a little while, so one could make allowances, shouldn't they? They are going to board with Mrs. Lynde until the manse is ready. If Marilla, in going down to Mrs. Lynde that evening, was actuated by any motive save her avowed one of returning the quilting frame she had borrowed the preceding winter, it was an amicable weakness shared by most of the Avonlea people. Many a thing Mrs. Lynde had lent, sometimes never expecting to see it again, came home that night in charge of the borrowers thereof. A new minister, and moreover a minister with a wife, was a lawful object of curiosity in a quiet little country settlement where sensations were few and far between. Old Mr. Bentley, the minister whom Anne had found lacking in imagination, had been a pastor of Avonlea for 18 years. He was a widower when he came, and a widower he remained, despite the fact that gossip regularly married him to this, that, or the other one, every year of his sojourn. In the preceding February, he resigned his charge and departed amid the regrets of his people, most of whom had the affection born of long intercourse for their good old minister in spite of his shortcomings as an orator. Since then, Avonlea Church had enjoyed a variety of religious disputation and listening to the many and various candidates and supplies who came Sunday after Sunday to preach on trial. These stood or fell by the judgment of the fathers and mothers in Israel. But a certain small red-haired girl who sat meekly in the corner of the old Cuthbert pew also had her opinions about them, and discussed the same in full with Matthew. Marilla always declining from principle to criticize ministers in any sharper form. I don't think Mr. Smith would have done, Matthew, as was Anne's final summing up. Mrs. Lynde says his delivery was so poor, but I think his worst fault was just like Mr. Bentley's. He had no imagination, and Mr. Terry had too much. He let it run away with him, just as I did mine in the matter of the haunted wood. Besides, Mrs. Lynde says his theology wasn't sound. Mr. Gershom was a very good man and a religious man, but he told too many funny stories and made the people laugh in church. He was undignified. And you must have some dignity about a minister, mustn't you, Matthew? I thought Mr. Marshall was decidedly attractive, but Mrs. Lynde says he isn't married or even engaged because she made special inquiries about him, and she says it would never do to have such a young married minister in Avonlea because he might marry in the congregation, and that would make trouble. Mrs. Lynde is a very far-seeing woman, isn't she, Matthew? I'm glad they called Mr. Allen. I liked him because his sermon was interesting, and he prayed as if he meant it.
not just as if he did it because he was in the habit of it. Mrs. Lynde says he isn't perfect, but she supposes we could expect a perfect minister for $750 a year. And anyhow, his theology is sound because she questioned him thoroughly on all the points of doctrine. And she knows his wife's people, and they are most respectable, and the women are all good housekeepers. Mrs. Lynde said that sound doctrine in the man and the good housekeeping in the woman makes an ideal combination for a minister's family. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant-faced couple still on their honeymoon and full of all good and beautiful enthusiasm for their chosen work. Avonlea opened its heart to them from the start, old and young, like the frank, cheerful young man with his high ideals and the bright, gentle little lady who assumed the mistressship of the manse. With Mrs. Allen, Anne fell promptly and wholeheartedly in love. She had discovered another kindred spirit. "Mrs. Allen is perfectly lovely," she announced one Sunday afternoon. "She's taken our class, and she's a splendid teacher. She says right away she didn't think it was fair for the teacher to ask all the questions. And you know, Marilla, that is exactly what I've always thought. She said we could ask her any questions we liked, and I asked ever so many. Excuse me. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla." "I believe you," was the emphatic comment. Nobody else asked any except Ruby Gillis. And she asked if there was to be a Sunday school picnic this summer. I didn't think that was a very proper question to ask, but because it hadn't any connection with the lesson. The lesson was about Daniel and the lion's den, but Mrs. Allen just smiled, and she said that she thought there would be. Mrs. Allen has a very lovely smile. She has such exquisite dimples in her cheeks. I wish I had dimples in my cheeks, Marilla. I'm not half so skinny as I was when I came here, but I have no dimples yet. If I had, perhaps I can influence people for good." Mrs. Allen said we ought to always try to influence other people for good. She talked so nice about everything. I never knew before that religion was such a cheerful thing. I've always thought it was a kind of melancholy, but Mrs. Allen's isn't, and I like to be a Christian. If I could be one like her, I'd want to be one like Superintendent Bell. "It's very naughty of you to speak so about Mr. Bell," said Marilla severely. "Mr. Bell is a real good man." "Oh, of course he's good," agreed Anne, "but he doesn't seem to get any comfort out of it. If I could be good, I'd dance and sing all day because I was glad of it. I suppose Mrs. Allen is too old to dance and sing, and of course it wouldn't be dignified in a minister's wife. But I can just feel she's glad she's a Christian, and that she'd be one even if she could get to heaven without it." "I suppose we must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea someday soon," said Marilla reflectively. "They've been most everywhere but here. Let me see. Next Wednesday would be a good time to have them. But don't say a word to Matthew about it, for if he knew they were coming, he'd find some excuse to be away that day. He got so used to Mr. Bentley he didn't mind him, but he's going to find it hard to get acquainted with a new minister, and a new minister's wife will frighten him to death." I'll be as secret as the dead," assured Anne. "But oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake for the occasion? I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know I can make a pretty good cake by this time." "You can make a layer cake," promised Marilla. Monday and Tuesday's great preparations went on at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was a serious and important undertaking, and Marilla was determined not to be eclipsed by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Anne was wild with excitement and delight. She talked it over with Dinah Tuesday night in the twilight as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble and made rainbows in the water with little twigs dipped in fir balsam. Everything is ready, Dinah, except my cake, which I'm to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits, which Marilla will make just before tea time. I assure you, Dinah, that Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. It's such a responsibility having a minister's family to tea. I never went through such an experience before. You should see our pantry. It's a sight to behold. We're going to have jelly chicken and cold tongue. We're to have two kinds of jelly, red, excuse me, red and yellow, and whipped cream and lemon pie, and cherry pie, and three kinds of cookies and a fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for ministers, and pound cake and layer cake and biscuits as foresaid, and new bread and old, both, in case the minister is dyspeptic and can't eat new. Mrs. Lynde says ministers are dyspeptic, but I don't think Mr. Allen has been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Dinah, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I was chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big yellow layer cake for a head. It will be good, all right, assured Dinah, who was a very comfortable sort of friend. I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Ildwood 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad just when you especially want them to be good, sighed Anne, setting a particularly well balsamic twig afloat. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust the Providence to be careful and put it in the flour. Oh, look, Dinah, what a lovely rainbow. Do you suppose the dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf? You know there's no such thing as a dryad, said Dinah. Dinah's mother had found out about the haunted wood and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Dinah had abstained from any further imitative flights of imagination and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief, even in harmless dryads. But it's so easy to imagine there is, said Anne. Every night before I go to bed, I look out my window and wonder if the dryad is really sitting here, combing her locks with the spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't give up your faith in the dryad. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbling in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia could have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, she drew a long breath. I'm sure I haven't forgotten anything this time, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? Just suppose perhaps the baking powder isn't good. I used it out of the new can, and Mrs. Lynde says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays when everything is so adulterated. Mrs. Lynde says the government ought to take the matter up, but she says we'll never see the day when a Tory government will do it. Marilla, what if the cake doesn't rise? We'll have plenty without it, said Marilla's unimpassioned way of looking at the subject. The cake did rise, however, and came out of the oven as light and feathery as a golden foam. Anne, flushed with delight, clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly, and in imagination saw Miss Allen eating it, possibly asking for another piece. You'll be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla, she said. Can I fix the table with ferns and wild roses? I think that's all nonsense, sniffed Marilla. In my opinion, it's the eatables that matter, and not flummery decorations. Mrs. Barry had her table decorated, said Anne, who was not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent. And the minister paid her an elegant compliment. He said it was a feast for the eye as well as the palate. Well, do as you like, said Marilla, who was quite determined not to be surpassed by Mrs. Barry or anybody else. Only mind you leave enough room for the dishes and the food. Anne laid herself out to decorate in a manner, after a fashion that should leave Mrs. Barry's nowhere. Having an abundance of roses and ferns, and a very artistic taste of her own, She made that tea table such a thing of beauty that when the minister and his wife sat down to it, they exclaimed in chorus over its loveliness. "It's Anne's doings," said Marilla grimly, and Anne felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. Matthew was there, having been inveigled into the party, only goodness, and Anne knew how. He had been in such a state of shyness and nervousness that Marilla had given him up in despair, but Anne took him in hand so successfully that he now sat at the table in his best clothes, white collar, and talked to the minister not uninterestingly. He never said a word to Mrs. Allen, but that perhaps was not to be expected. All went well as a marriage bell until Anne's layer cake was passed. Mrs. Allen, having already been helped to a bewildering variety, declined it. But Marilla, seeing the disappointment on Anne's face, said smilingly, "Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it on purpose for you." "In that case, I must sample it," laughed Mrs. Allen, helping herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers, and a most peculiar expression crossed her face. Not a word did she say, however, but steadily ate away at it. Marilla saw the expression and hastened to taste the cake. "Aunt Shirley," she exclaimed, "what on earth did you put into that cake?" "Nothing but what the recipe said, Marilla," cried Anne with a look of anguish. "Oh, isn't it all right?" "All right? It's simply horrible. Mrs. Allen, don't try to eat it. And taste it yourself. What flavor did you use?" "Vanilla," said Anne, her face scarlet with mortification after tasting the cake. Only vanilla. Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I had my suspicions on that baking powder fiddlesticks. Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used." Anne fled to the pantry and returned with a small bottle partially filled with brown liquid and labeled yellowy, "Best vanilla." Marilla took it, uncorked it, and smelled it. "Mercy on us! And you flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week, poured what was left into an empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. I should have warned you. But for pity's sakes, why couldn't you have smelled it?" Anne dissolved into tears under this double disgrace. "I couldn't. I had such a cold." And with this, she fairly fled to the gable chamber, where she cast herself on the bed and wept as one who refuses to be comforted. Pleasantly, a light step sounded on the stairs, and somebody entered the room. "Oh, Marilla," sobbed Anne without looking up. "I'm disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down. It will get out. Things always do get out in Avonlea. Dinah will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I will always be pointed at as the girl who flavored cake with anodyne liniment. Gil, the boys in school will never get over laughing at it. Oh, Marilla, if you have a spark of Christian pity, don't tell me that I must go down and wash the dishes after this. I wash them when the minister and his wife are gone, but I cannot ever look Mrs. Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. Mrs. Lynde says she knows an orphan girl who tried to poison her benefactor. But the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, although not in cakes. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla?" "Suppose you jump up and tell her yourself," said a merry voice. Anne flew up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, surveying her with laughing eyes. "My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this," she said, genuinely disturbed by Anne's tragic face. "Why, it's all just a funny mistake that anybody might make." "Oh, no, it takes me to make such a mistake," said Anne forlornly. "And I wanted to have that cake so nice for you, Mrs. Allen." "Yes, I know, dear, and I assure you, I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it had turned out all right. Now, you mustn't cry any more, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. Miss Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot all of your own. I want to see it, for I am very much interested in flowers. Anne permitted herself to be led down and comforted, reflecting that it was really providential that Mrs. Allen was a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and when the guests went away, Anne found that she had enjoyed the evening more than could have been expected, considering that terrible incident. Nevertheless, she sighed deeply. Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet? I warrant you'll make plenty in it, said Marilla. I never saw your beat for making mistakes, Anne. Yes, and well, I know it, admitted Anne mournfully. But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice. I don't know as that's much benefit when you're always making new ones. Oh, don't you see, Marilla? There must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make, and when I get to the end of them, then I will be through with them. That's a very comforting thought. Well, you better go and give that cake to the pigs, said Marilla. It isn't fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Butte. Chapter 22. Anne is invited out to tea. And what are your eyes popping out of your head about now? Asked Marilla, when Anne had just come in from a run to the post office. Have you discovered another kindred spirit? Excitement hung around Anne like a garment shone in her eyes. Kindled in every feature, she had come dancing up the lane like a wind-blown sprite through the mellow sunrise and lazy shadows of the August evening. No, Marilla, but oh, what do you think? I'm invited to tea at the manse tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. Allen left the letter for me at the post office. Just look at it, Marilla. Mrs. Anne Shirley, Green Gables. This is the first time I was ever called Miss. Such a thrill as it gave me. I shall cherish it forever amongst my choicest treasures. Miss Allen told me she meant to have all the members of her Sunday school class to tea in turn, said Marilla, regarding the wonderful event very coolly. You needn't get such a fever over it. Do learn to take things calmly, child. For Anne to take things calmly would have been to change her nature. All spirit and fire and dew, as she was. The pleasures and pains of life came to her with a troubled intensity. Marilla felt this and was vaguely troubled over it, realizing that the ups and downs of existence would probably bear hardly on this impulsive soul, and not sufficiently understanding that the equally great capacity for delight might more than compensate. Therefore, Marilla conceived it to be her duty to drill Anne into a tranquil uniformity of disposition as impossible and alien to her as to a dancing sunbeam in one of the brook's shallows. She did not make such headway as she sorrowfully admitted to herself. The downfall of some dear hope or plan plunged Anne into a deeps of affliction. The fulfillment thereof exalted her to dizzy realms of delight. Marilla had almost begun to despair of ever fashioning this waif of the world into her model little girl of demure manners and prim deportment. Neither would she have believed that she really liked Anne much better as she was. Anne went to bed that night speechless with misery because Matthew had said the wind was round northeast and he feared it would be a rainy day tomorrow. The rustle of the poplar leaves about the house worried her. It sounded like pattering raindrops and the full, far-away roar of the Gulf, to which she listened delightedly at other times, loving its strange, sonorous, haunting rhythm, now seemed like a prophecy of a storm and disaster to a small maiden who particularly wanted a fine day. Anne thought that morning would never come. But all things have an end, even nights before the day on which you are invited to take tea at the manse. The morning, in spite of Matthew's predictions, was fine, and Anne's spirits soared to their highest. Oh, Marilla, there is something in me today that makes me just love everybody I see, she exclaimed, as she washed the breakfast dishes. You don't know how good I feel. Wouldn't it be nice if it could last? I believe I would be a model child if I were just invited out to tea every day. But oh, Marilla, it's a solemn occasion too. I feel so anxious. What if I shouldn't behave properly? You know I never had tea at a manse before, and I'm not sure that I know all the rules of etiquette. Although I've been studying the rules given in the etiquette department of the Family Herald ever since I came here, I'm so afraid I'll do something silly or forget to do something I should do. Would it be good manners to take a second helping of anything if you wanted to very much? The trouble with you, Anne, is that you're thinking too much about yourself. You should just think of Mrs. Allen and what would be nicest and most agreeable to her, said Marilla, hitting for once in her life on a very sound and pithy piece of advice. Anne instantly realized this. You're right, Marilla. I'll try not to think about myself at all. Anne evidently got through her visit without any serious breach of etiquette, for she came home through the twilight under a great high-sprung sky, gloried over the trails of saffron and rosy cloud in a beatified state of mind, and told Marilla all about it happily, sitting on the big red sandstone slab at the kitchen door, with her tired, curly head in Marilla's gingham lap. A cool wind was blowing down over the long harvest fields from the rims of the furry western hills and whistling through the poplars. One clear star hung over the orchard, and the fireflies were flitting over in Lover's Lane, in and out among the ferns and rustling boughs, and Anne watched them as she talked and somehow felt that the wind and stars and fireflies were all tangled up together into something unutterably sweet and enchanting. Oh, Marilla, I've had a most fascinating time. I feel that I have not lived in vain, and I should always feel that even if I should never be invited to tea at a manse again. When I got there, Mrs. Allen met me at the door. She was dressed in the sweetest dress of pale pink organdy, with dozens of frills and elbow sleeves, and she looked just like a seraph. I really think I'd like to be a minister's wife when I grow up, Marilla. A minister mightn't mind my red hair, because he wouldn't be thinking of such worldly things. But then, of course, one would be naturally good, and I'll never be that. So I suppose there's no use in thinking about it. Some people are naturally good, you know, and others are not. I'm one of the others. Mrs. Lynde says I'm full of original sin. No matter how hard I try to be good, I can never make such a success of it as those who are naturally good. It's a good deal like geometry, I expect. But don't you think the trying so hard ought to count for something? Mrs. Allen is one of the naturally good people. I love her passionately. You know, there are some people like Matthew and Mrs. Allen that you can love right off without any trouble. And then there are others, like Mrs. Lynde, that you have to try very hard to love. You know you ought to love them because they know so much, and they are such active workers in the church. But you have to keep reminding yourself of it all the time, or else you forget. There was another little girl at the manse to tea, from the White Sands Sunday School. Her name was Laurette Bradley, and she was a very nice little girl. Not exactly a kindred spirit, you know, but still very nice. We had an elegant tea, and I think I kept all the rules of etiquette pretty well. After tea, Mrs. Allen played and sang, and she got Loretta and me to sing too. Mrs. Allen says that I have a good voice, and she says I must sing in the Sunday school choir after this. You can't think how thrilled I was at the mere thought. I've longed so to sing in the Sunday school choir as Dinah does, but I feared it was an honor that I could never aspire to. Loretta had to go home early because there's a big concert in the White Sands Hotel tonight, and her sister is to recite at it. Loretta says that The Americans at the hotel give a concert every fortnight in aid of the Charlottetown Hospital, and they ask lots of the White Sands people to recite. Loretta says she expected to be asked herself someday. I just gazed at her in awe. After she had gone, Mrs. Allen and I had a heart-to-heart talk. I told her everything about Mrs. Thomas and the twins, and Katie Maurice and Violetta, and coming to Green Gables, and my troubles over geometry. And would you believe it, Marilla? Mrs. Allen told me she was a dunce at geometry, too. You don't know how that encouraged me. Mrs. Lynde came to the manse just before I left, and what do you think, Marilla? The trustees have hired a new teacher, and it's a lady. Her name is Miss Muriel Stacy. Isn't that a romantic name? Mrs. Lynde said they never had a female teacher in Avonlea before. She thinks it's a dangerous innovation, but I think it'll be splendid to have a lady teacher. And I really don't see how I'm going to live through the 2 weeks before school begins. I'm so impatient to see her. Okay, we'll start the next chapter. Chapter 23, Anne comes to grief in an affair of honor. Anne had to live through more than 2 weeks as it happened, almost a month having elapsed since the liniment cake episode. It was high time for her to get into fresh trouble of some sort, little mistakes, such as absent-mindedly emptying a pan of skimmed milk into a basket of yarn balls in the pantry instead of into the pig's bucket, and walking clean over to the edge of the log bridge into the brook while wrapped in an imaginative reverie, not really being worth counting. A week after tea at the manse, Dinah Barry gave a party. Small and select, Anne assured Marilla. Just the girls in our class. They had a very good time, and nothing untoward happened until after tea, when they found themselves in the berry garden, a little tired of all their games and ripe for any enticing form of mischief which might present itself. This presently took the form of daring. Daring was the fashionable amusement among the Avonlea small fry just then. It had begun among the boys, but soon spread to the girls, and all the silly things that were done in Avonlea that summer because the doers thereof were dared to do them would fill a book by themselves. First of all, Carrie Sloane dared Ruby Gillis to climb to a certain point in the huge old willow tree before the front door, which Ruby Gillis, albeit in mortal dread of the fat green caterpillars with which said tree was infested, and with fear of her mother before her eyes if she should tear her new muslin dress, nimbly did, to the discomfiture of the aforesaid Carrie Sloane. Then Josie Pye dared Anne Andrews to hop on her left leg around the garden without stopping once or putting her right foot to the ground, which Jane Andrews did gamely try to do, but gave out at the third corner and had to confess herself defeated. Josie's triumph being rather more pronounced than good taste permitted, Anne Shirley dared her to walk along the top of the board fence which bounded the garden to the east. Now, to walk board fences requires more skill and steadiness of head and heel than one might suppose who has ever tried it. But Josie Pye, if deficient in some qualities that makes for popularity, had at least a natural and inborn gift duly cultivated for walking board fences. Josie walked the berry fence with an airy unconcern, which seemed to imply that a little thing like that wasn't worth a dare. Reluctant admiration greeted her exploit, for the most of the girls could appreciate it, having suffered many things themselves in the efforts to walk fences. Josie descended from her perch, flustered with victory, and darted a defiant glance at Anne. Anne tossed her red braids. I don't think it's such a very wonderful thing to walk a little low board fence, she said. I knew a girl in Marysville who could walk the ridgepole of a roof. I don't believe it, said Josie flatly. I don't believe anybody could walk a ridgepole. You couldn't. Anyhow, couldn't I? Cried Anne rationally. Okay, guys, that's where we're going to stop now. And that's it. So, thank you and have a great week.